universities. He became a mathematician, and in the 30s he went to the United States and taught mathematics at the University of Urbana, Illinois. He did not do economics during his professional career, but while his father was still alive, he helped his father as much as he could with the second edition of the Principles of Economics. Now, somebody should quote the German original title of that book, Karl Menger's Grundsätze der Volkswirtschaftslehre. That was the original title. Book appeared in 1871. It's a historic day because nothing like that was ever published on economics before. He just started from scratch and built it up. And it was understood that it was incomplete and he was going to come up with a continuation. And they talked about the second edition, which would be more complete. And towards the end of his life, his son was already a university student, and he helped his father in doing that. But this is very, very unfortunate that the cooperation wasn't successful. Certainly was not completed in the sense that the second edition never came out, but of course the scrappy notes and so on have survived, and it was not possible to salvage it and make it a proper second edition. This is one of the great unfortunate things about the history of economics. So that's about the background. I consider Menger one of the greatest geniuses of the human race at the level of Plato. I don't mention Aristotle because I don't really consider Aristotle a very great genius. He was one of those type of professors who were collecting insects and started categorizing it. But he made just too many mistakes and presented it as basic truth. So, while I'm saying that, I must also acknowledge the great thing which Aristotle did was to present logic, formal logic. He codified the basic laws of logic, and this did survive, and this is the great merit. But what he said about other things, and the disaster is what he said about interest. That's a complete disaster. So I just have to mention this. I may be prejudiced, so, I don't want to have an argument about that. Some of you may consider Aristotle one of the greatest fathers of science. I'm not one of them, but I'm not really prepared to discuss this because very soon we get to the level of discussing religion, basically what you believe or what you don't believe. But there are other very great names in science, and I don't have to go through the list. I would consider Menger at the top. It is really a unique achievement what he did in economic science. And so I have to start with this admission of humiliation. I am completely aware that I'm working or I'm talking about some things which only the greatest human minds have had success, and that's Menger's. So I'm aware of that, and this is a great responsibility. And I have been working, thinking, writing, and so on for years, and the more I think about the greater my respect for Menger becomes, and I would like to transpire, if this would transpire through my lectures, which I hope. I know it will not be completely successful because the subject is difficult and it's so different from what they are teaching at universities and schools, but I think it is worth to make the effort and see it from the other point. So you have this handout, right? Credit. I am writing this book. I'm, say, halfway through, but the course, the subject of this course is only a third of what here you have the table of contents. It says book 1, book 2, and book 3. Now what we are doing in this course is basically book 1. I'm not following this in any, and it's not even complete because chapter 6 is, and which one doesn't matter, but whatever is there you can read ahead. And I'm suggesting that you read the 2 introductions, because this is supposed to be the second edition of lecture notes which I have already published. They didn't publish in the sense of the usual sense of the word, but I have given courses, lectures, and so on. So that was a set of lecture notes which no longer exists because as I started rewriting it, I cut up the only few remaining copies. But anyhow, I call this second edition, and there was it's not here, the forward to in the first edition, which was 2004, I thought we did have that here. Well, I don't know what happened. So many things happened to me during the past few months. Well, we can certainly make it available to you. That's not; they are not long or anything, but I don't see them. So, just to give you an idea about the structure, as I say, we have book 1. So you have that here, the table, detailed table of contents. And I entitled this Credit Arising Out of Savings, because the concept of credit, to my mind, has 2 great sources. And the first source is this: credit arising out of savings. But there is a second source which a lot of people, or I would even say all economists ignore, especially today. I mean, in the 19th century, this was properly acknowledged and legitimized, no question about it, that credit had a second source, which was consumption. This may sound paradoxical, but sure enough, there is a second source, and the great name here is Adam Smith. He developed what today is called the real bills doctrine, and that is what it is: credit arising out of consumption, as opposed to credit arising out of savings. Now, there is a numerical indicator which tells you whether the source is abundant or the source is meager. And in the case of credit arising out of savings, we shall see that this numerical indicator is nothing but the rate of interest. So interest and credit arising out of savings is a concept. And the corresponding thing, when we talk about credit arising out of consumption, this has absolutely nothing to do with the rate of interest. That's very important to realize from the start, at the beginning of this course. Because what is the numerical indicator of the abundance or meagerness of the source? What is it? The discount rate. And today to say this is heretical. Virtually all the economists today would say this is garbage, even in our own camp. The Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, United States, considers this a very great heresy to say that interest and discount are separate concepts. To them, it's the same concept. The only difference is that the discount is short-term and interest, the rest of it, long-term. And also, perhaps, the manner of paying this return to capital, which is interest or discount. Because when you have a note, for instance, a treasury note, it pays the yield, the return, in a different way. Now, the bond pays the yield by coupons, which is attached to the bond. And if you have $1,000 bond maturing, say, in 30 years, then it has attached a quarterly coupon for every year, so that's 120 coupons. Every quarter, at the end of the quarter, you clip off the coupon, present it to the bank, and then you get your yield, your return. It's a fixed rate. Okay. Now, a note is different. No coupons attached. Say it's $1,000 note, one year note. Okay. No coupons. What happens is that this $1,000 note is at issue, when they issue it, is auctioned off. And nobody will bid $1,000, but they will bid less, because they will bid a lower price, which will increase in value. So at maturity, 1 year from now, it will be paid off by the full amount of $1,000. You understand this? That you have a financial instrument which you buy at the discounted price, and it increases in value up to maturity when you get the full face value. No coupons, no. So this idea of auctioning it off, you don't even know what rate of return you will get, because it will depend on the auction. If the demand is great, then they bid up the price higher, so the return will be lower. If the demand is slack, then you will get it at a lower price, which will correspond to the higher discount rate. But the important thing is, from our point of view here, is that the cause and the nature of that yield, of that return, is entirely different from the cause and the nature of interest. And this is what our opponents are denying. And we have a lot more to say about this in due course. But at this beginning, this course, by the way, is not going to say very much more about discounts and real bills and Adam Smith, because that would be the subject of the second course. Okay, the first is strictly about credit arising out of savings as opposed to credit arising out of consumption. But I wanted to warn you, this is just half of a loaf. Our opponents would say it's the whole loaf. There's nothing more to that. It's just kind of terminology that short-term interest is called discount, and this type of credit, this manner of paying the yield deserves another concept. So, but that's all there is to it, and that's not. We are facing two entirely different theories. I'm just warning you in advance that we are not going to make that confusion. And later on we have a little more to say, but really the job will be done only after you go through the second course. In this course we are concentrating on credit arising out of savings. So I will now start discussion. Oh, there's something here by way of introduction, so I will give it to you as a reading assignment. It's not long, it's only 4 pages. Book 1 has an introductory part, and did you find it after the table of contents? There's this introduction, 4 pages, all right? I would like you to read it. So in the future I will assume that you have all read it. Perhaps I just say a few words about the highlights here. I think properly enough I start with a quotation from the Bible. Actually it's not a quotation, it's a story lifted out of the Bible. It's the Old Testament, Genesis, and it's the story of Joseph, who, as you may recall, was traveling with his brothers, and Joseph was the favorite of the father. Jacob was the father. So what happened was that the brothers were envious because Joseph was the favorite son, the youngest and the favorite son, and they wanted to dispose of him. And what they did was they tied him up and sold him into slavery. And they just said that to the father later, what happened was that these bandits took him and did this selling into slavery. But in fact, what happened was Joseph got through the channels of slave trade to the Farrell of the Egyptians, and he was working in the kitchen or some kind of lowly job, and the Pharaoh had a dream. Well, I'm just refreshing your memory. I'm assuming you're all familiar with this. And according to this dream, there was a river, and there were 7 cows on one bank and 7 on the other. And there's a very conspicuous difference between them, because on 7 cows on the one bank were sleek, fat, very healthy looking, and the 7 cows on the opposite bank of the river were rickety. They were not very good looking, sickly looking. And then the interesting thing happened according to the dream of the Pharaoh. The the rickety cows came over and they devoured the fat, sleek cows. And that was the end of the dream, and the Pharaoh couldn't make any sense of it, and then he called together his advisors and scientists and so on, looking for explanations. Of course, they couldn't give a coherent explanation. And then in the kitchen, Joseph made him famous by interpreting dreams of lowly colleagues with whom he was working, and he had a fame for that, because in many cases this was confirmed by what happened afterwards. So the word got into the ears of the prime minister, let's call him, of the country of Egypt, and he reported to the Pharaoh that down there in the kitchen there's this kitchen boy, and he interprets dreams, and apparently he is good at it, because that's the feedback which is coming. So the Farrell wanted to see him immediately, and Joseph appeared in front of Farrell, and he was told what the dream was about, and now please give us your interpretation. Without any hesitation, Joseph said that the 7 fat, sleek cows represent 7 plentiful years, harvest, in succession. And the 7 rickety cows represented the following 7-year period where the harvest was bad, not enough to feed the population of the country. Too much for 7 years, too little for the following 7 years. And the meaning of the rickety cows devouring the fat cows means that the people in the good years, when the harvest was good, they were wasteful. They were unmindful of that they might be pressing their luck too hard, so that there might be some bad years coming, and therefore they had to suffer the consequences. So he went on, Joseph, and suggested to the Pharaoh that the dream is really a warning that during the 7 plentiful years, they should put some away as a reserve. Save. And that will be helping through the country the following 7 bad years. But you need foresight. You have to see the problem and you have to plan it and so on. And this sounded very convincing to the Pharaoh. On the spot, he appointed him the czar of economic czar of the country. He had full power. So indeed, 7 good years followed, and Joseph, in his new position now, from a kitchen boy, he became the top government official. He bought up the surpluses at a cheap price. Because in good years, plentiful harvest means low price for grain. And built up this store of grains which he had control of, and when the 7 after the 7 fat years came the 7 lean years, he started selling out of the store which he had accumulated earlier, and that worked very well because it was helpful to the treasury. The treasury is in good shape. They bought cheap and they sold at a higher price. But at the same time, there was no famine in the country. This is one of the great stories in our tradition, because it's a message from God, if you like, directly. The message is that you've got to use your brain to plan ahead and cover the contingencies, such as famine or failure of harvest. And I thought I couldn't start it with a better introduction than that. This is what humans can do. Now, true enough, some animals do that as well. Savings. And the first animal which comes to mind is squirrels, but there are many others. But even the English word as a verb, squirrel, to squirrel away, suggests that what is happening is that you save surpluses to carry it over, and it supports the life of the squirrels. In the wintertime, they find the holes in the trees and they just store there. But what scientists found that this was very, very different from what we humans call saving, because our savings are planned in a way, and there's a lot of brain work going into this. But the squirrels, poor things, they do squirrel far more than they need, and they forget about where they put them, and they just have to work just as hard in the wintertime to find the squirreled away nuts or whatever they have, and then feed themselves. So this is a very great difference. And you think of the bees who make honey and then they keep themselves in good shape in the wintertime. We know very well that they save far more honey than they need, because the beekeeper has a good income from keeping the bees and just taking 90% of the honey harvest and leave the 10% for the bees to survive in the wintertime. And if you think of it, this is very, very interesting. I'm not going to spend more time on this, but I suggest that think of the Bible, story of Joseph, and think of the difference between human saving and animal saving, like a squirrel. And think of the difference between the two. And this is the beginning. You have savings, and that is like providing for the future. Now, as I say, this is really a reading assignment, but just to help you to understand this, I talk about marginal form of saving. And by this I mean that as history developed, people found that they could save in different forms. They could save grain, they could save non-perishable food, and they could save them in other forms. Metals turned out to be a good form of saving, and even within metals there was a hierarchy, more and more desirable forms of saving, and the very top is gold and silver. And this is where Menger did his great job of describing that process, how the market evolved gold and silver as the most marketable goods, which means really the best form of saving, durable and so on, but that doesn't concern us here. Now, this happened, and gold and silver became money, and then came government, and government said that we are short of money, so why not ban gold? Ban gold as money. The government disallowed gold to be used as money. Well, we know this happened, But just ask what is the consequence. Will people then say, oh, I can't do my savings anymore, so I'm going to die? People know. People didn't say that. People went to, say, silver. And then it was transferred, the role of saving was transferred to silver. Government banned silver as well. Well, then they picked something else, copper. It's not important what they picked. The important thing is that they can always pick something. So the government is really in a dead-end street. It's counterproductive because there will always be something what I call the marginal form of saving. And to suggest that, oh, this is old story, this is not interesting in a modern, complex, beautiful economy like ours, and that's for the birds, this story about marginal saving. It's not. Because even today there is a marginal form of saving. And to prove this, well, you just have to read this, that, for instance, you are a producer of some goods. And it doesn't really matter what this good is. The important thing is that you look at it or consider it like a channel which has an input and has an output and. And there's a more or less continuous flow of lower, say, higher order good. That's the Böhm-Bawerk terminology, but it's not important. A higher order and a lower order. And order one is already the consumer good. But let's just say this is semi-finished and this is also semi-finished, but at a lower order, meaning closer to the consumer. This is a schematic description of production, which for our purposes is very satisfying and convincing. Now, there are two ways of the producer can do savings. Whatever reason, he doesn't agree with the forecast of the economists, which call for a good year, or he considers negative factors. He wants to save. He could do saving at both ends of his production unit, the input and the output end. What he does is he uses leads and lags. That these are the English words, leads and lags. If he keeps buying these ingredients of his production faster than he actually needs it, and has a little bit of store there, that this means he increased his leads. And when he wants to undo this, then he has lags. In other words, he is buying the inputs more slowly than otherwise because he no longer needs this little cushion there. So he will feed this store into the production. But he can also do this at the output end, leads and lags. And you read this and think about it, and then it's up to him to decide whether he wants to do one type of saving or the other, or a combination of both. And whatever he is doing is we call a marginal form of saving. So this is just to show you that the government ultimately is helpless. They want to control money because money is the most marketable, the highest form of saving. And they try to do one after the other, but the ingenuity of human brain will always find a way out. So this is just out of the question that ultimately the government can succeed in controlling money, because this would mean controlling the savings activities of the people, but there is just no way to do that for the government.